Hello once again everyone, we're back, not in the shed today. It is incredibly hot. I don't know what time it is right now, I think it's about 8 o'clock in the evening and it still must be definitely well north of 20 degrees, if not 30. I just wanted to really take the opportunity to introduce to you a little project that I've had on the shelf for a while. I've got many projects on the shelf because I'm one of these people who tends to start many projects and then not finish them, but that's just the way I am. Anyway, this one's pretty interesting, and it is this. The Yamaha SPX 90, which is a rack mount effects unit from the 80s, well, late 80s, early 90s I think. Does it have a year on it? I should have probably done my homework. Anyway, yeah, late 80s I think. And it's from that time when rack mount effects units in the studio were a thing, but they were very expensive. Multi-thousand-pound Lexicon reverbs were kind of the thing to have. And this thing, well, it was, I wouldn't say it was affordable, but it was more affordable than those. Because it was kind of like an entry level but very usable unit for all those kinds of things, doing reverbs and modulation effects, it was very widely used. The reason I actually ended up with one of these was because I think it was Rick Beato's channel that I was watching, and he happened to mention some producer and he rattled off all of these albums that he'd used this particular effects unit on, and it was all stuff that I really held in high regard. I think it was like Nirvana's Nevermind, some Alice in Chains, earlier Perfect Circle albums. This guy had produced on all of these records and had apparently used this very unit to do some of the chorus effects and various other bits and bobs, which I thought, well, if those are albums that I really love and quite often aspire to get the sounds from, then it would make good sense to have the unit. The unit itself, you can occasionally pick them up for about 50 or 60 pounds. There's many iterations of them. They start off at the Yamaha SPX 50, I think it is. Then there's the 90. Then I think there's later iterations called the 1000, 2000, etc. All the later iterations really add is a bit more memory, some additional outputs. On this unit, you can see if I sweep across the back, it is just mono to stereo output. There's no stereo input. I think on the later models you get XLR as well. But I think the later units all have the earlier patches on as well, so that's pretty great. They are pretty notorious for failing. The power supplies in them do tend to fail quite often. I never really fully ascertained whether that's due to bad design or whether it's just the kind of power supply they are. They've got aging capacitors in them and they get quite hot as well. So it's always a good idea to service one of these things if you've got it in working condition, that is. If you haven't got it in working condition, then quite often it can be repaired just by replacing the capacitors. Not always, but sometimes. This particular one that I bought is actually in full working order. I can tell that someone's been inside it before because it has a screw missing and the case is a little bit marked and a little bit bent. I believe this kettle lead, as I would call it, I forget the proper name, is it IEC, whatever. Well, it's had one of those things spliced onto the cable. I think originally they would have just had a full length power cable with a plug on the end, but I mean that's a nice thing to have. When I get inside it, I may find that it's already been serviced, I may find that it hasn't. Regardless of that though, if I am going to service it, I need to come up with a full list of components that I need to buy to service it. And also you can see when we swept across the front there, the display is still working, but it's a little dim. In a dark, dim studio, it's actually still in good enough shape, but in normal daylight conditions in the living room it's pretty much unreadable. Now, I've seen people out there on eBay trying to charge something like 50 quid plus for a new display for one of these things, but they are actually a generic part number that was used across many items at the time. You can still buy them today. I've not actually opened this one up yet and had a look at the display, but they are a generic part number, as I say, which I'll put across the bottom of the screen now, so that if you need to buy one yourself, you can get a hold of one. The only thing I have been told to watch out for is apparently the pin connections, I think, on the display on this unit, I think are on the, I forget now, whether, I think they're on the side, and most of the generic units come with the pin outs on the top, or the other way around. We'll see when we get in there. But yeah, so definitely one task to do, and that's to try and replace that display, and the other task maybe is going to be to service it. So let's get inside and see what condition it's in. I should probably point out at this point, I've not done one of these before. Sure, I've messed around with electronics and pedals and things, but it's normally completely analog electronics. I tell a lie, I did repair one vintage synth once, which was kind of half digital. So all of down this side is the power supply, and it's all of these capacitors, really, the electrolytic capacitors in the power supply, that can cause you problems, mainly because this side gets very hot. Normally the capacitors that are in here by default, I think, are about, they're rated for something like 80 degrees. It's a very good idea if you can actually buy slightly higher spec capacitors that will run at about 105 degrees or more. We have a little bias pot down here at the front to adjust the output voltage from the power supply board. It should be at 5 volts or very close to 5 volts. I'm fairly certain, as I say, that these are new capacitors that are in there. You can see a little bit of splooge down there, which may have leaked off a capacitor at some point. Yeah, the capacitors actually look really good. I mean, if I have the opportunity to get one rated at a higher temperature for there, then that's great. But it looks in pretty good shape. Anyway, over on this side of the board, as you can probably imagine with all these little integrated circuits, these are responsible for all of the digital effects. Now, it's kind of from an era, everything that you're doing over here on this side of the board nowadays would literally just be done on a little microprocessor, no problem at all. Trying to suss out all of these capacitors around here are involved in the actual audio signal output. They can go wrong as well. And again, they deserve to be replaced, and they deserve to be replaced generally as well with higher quality audio grade capacitors if you can manage it. But again, to me, they actually, no, I think that's original solder on there, so I don't think these ones have been replaced. They have a little bit of a dry joint around that one as well. I'd be surprised if someone did actually service this side and not at least do the key capacitors down around that area. But let's have a look at what we came to focus on for now, which is the display. So there we have it. One exposed display unit, and you can see it is on the side that all the connections are on. The question is, the one I bought on AliExpress for a princely sum of £1.42, is it going to work, and is it going to be a direct replacement? Well, let's find out. Well, certainly looks the part, wouldn't you say? Very similar. We've even got the black border around the screen, and the pin connectors are definitely on the correct end. It's a good start. Looking side by side there, I'd say everything is pretty much bang on, assuming of course the pin outs are the same to marry up. Now, I have been told, by the way, you can actually just buy the light units to go on the back of these rather than buying the whole display, but well, for £1, less than £1.50, I figured I might as well have the whole display. I think this one is possibly OLED as well. But yeah, it's just going to be a question of getting that off and resoldering everything on in the same place, hopefully. Okay, so I'm back, having done a little bit of research, and as far as I can tell, I do think that these caps in the power supply have been replaced. Everything else does seem more or less original, including, I think, the caps within the audio circuitry. This cap here, the big power cap, I'm not entirely sure about. I think that one is still probably original. But what's certainly clear is that this board has been cooked to hell. I haven't really come across another one that's like this. I mean, it's severely discoloured all across, particularly around this heat source of this big transistor here with the heatsink on it. I think what I really want to do is get the board out and have a look underneath to see if I can see evidence of work having been done in the past. I suspect that I'll be able to tell that these are more fresh solder joints or solder joints than some of the other ones. Trying to be so careful with these connectors because I'm used to working inside laptops where if you just tug on the wires and things like that, they'll just break. I have seen people pull these connectors out just by the wires themselves, but I really don't like to do that. There we go. Yeah, so definite evidence of some soldering being done here. More than you would think. These resistors seem to have been done. I mean, they could have just been reflowed, of course, but the big power cap has been done by the looks of it. Certainly all the caps down this end. That does give me some confidence that these caps actually aren't too old, and I can't see any bulging anywhere. So I think I'm happy to leave that as is, really, without doing anything to it, which is great because it saves money. I was concerned when I first saw this brown stuff kind of at some locations on the board, but it turns out that's actually just epoxy or something that they've used to glue the stuff down to the board when it was originally made, and over time and with the heat and everything it's just gone crusty. But it's not electrolyte or anything like that, and to be honest with you, that stuff could go conductive or anything, so best just to have it off where I can. So yeah, all I really need to do is make sure that's kicking out the correct voltage, and I think we're going to be okay there. So one thing I haven't really pointed out yet, partly because it's only really just sunk in, is the power switching situation on this. Now, this is the first time I've seen inside one of these units, but I had seen multiple videos on people servicing them and that kind of thing, and one thing I always noticed was there was a power switch located on the back of the power supply circuit board, which I always thought was a little odd, because I mean my immediate thought actually was, well, it's very nice of them to provide a power switch for you to use just when you're inside servicing the thing. But no, actually in reality the proper design is that this is the main power switch, and then what it normally has is a spring-loaded mechanical lever going along the side here, which actually goes to the power button at the front. I can only assume the reason for doing that is because it means you don't have to run the 240 volt AC lines right the way through the power supply, potentially creating noise, but you still get to have a proper main power switch on the front. I mean, that just leads me, the fact that that lever is actually completely missing here and the power switch is missing and has been bridged, I mean, it just leads me to think more and more that this unit has been put together from spare parts. You know, maybe someone's had a couple of units and, you know, they've got the best they can out of a couple of non-working units maybe, and this one's been kind of cobbled together into a working condition from spares, which is fine. I don't object to that. I mean, when I bought it sold as seen, and I got it for the same kind of price as you would pay for a completely non-working unit. Just the only difference there is normally the non-working units, or because they've got generic capacitors and things which have blown, which you can of course replace. In this instance, there's no way in hell I'm going to find a spare part for sale by itself to actually be able to replace this loss. I could get an equivalent switch. An equivalent or very similar switch wouldn't be a problem at all, but to actually get a rod that would run to the front where the power button actually is, I'd probably have to fabricate one, which would be a lot of work. What actually came in the front of this unit where the power switch is supposed to be was actually a button which looks like it matches, but just glued in to the front of the unit. But when I actually read the text on the front of the unit, it says feedback phase on there. So I think that's come off a different Yamaha effects unit or a mixer, and it just so happens it's the same style that fits in that hole. Now that hole is 1/2 inch, and there are actually plenty of square 1/2 inch switches out there on the market which would actually switch 250 volts main. So I could actually put a power switch in there which would look, obviously it wouldn't be the original, but it would look right for the unit. And it would work. The only problem there is I would then actually be running the 240 volts AC along there, which, well, it could create noise. It might not. I'm inclined to think I could probably get away with it because the audio signal doesn't actually pass anywhere near down this side of the unit. I mean, all the audio is done over this side. So that is something I could consider. As long as I do it safely, then that shouldn't be a problem at all. Or I could just leave the unit as it is and just have it turn on instantly when you turn it on at the wall, which isn't bad either. I don't know from a resale perspective which would be better or worse really. I think it's probably a good idea to try and get the switch in, but it's not something I have to do immediately. I'm more concerned with getting this thing up and running for now. So I've got the power supply board screwed back in for now, and the next thing I'm going to do is actually just proceed to get this LCD replaced, because that was the one main thing that I actually needed to do. So as I mentioned, the plan is to replace this display. It still works, but the backlight is failing. In theory, don't know if I can twist it around so you can see, the backlight mechanism is just slid into the side of the display here. So in theory, I could unsolder that, slide it out, and slide a new one in, but I figured since I could get an entire new display of a better quality for about £1.50, then it made no odds really. I might as well just replace the entire thing. The display, as I've already mentioned, is a standard model number. However, it has become apparent that there is actually some difference in the sizing of the circuit board. The circuit board as it currently is will still screw back onto the front of the unit, just whether or not it actually lines up properly or perfectly with the window is another question. I may find myself having to do a bit of a bodge job and effectively like glue it or tape it or something onto the front of the unit just to get it lined up perfectly. I mean, there would be nothing stopping me just sort of taping that in place there once it's wired in, but obviously I'd like to get it screwed in because that's a much better hold. So I'm just going to stick some YouTube on and set about with the soldering iron. I'm just actually going to connect up this end first of all. All of these pins here should be enough to actually get the display working just without the backlight. The backlight pins do not seem to be in exactly the same place for the connector that's there, so I'm just going to leave that off for now and check that the display is working before I start considering cutting wires or anything like that. Well, that took some doing. My solder sucker was a bit too big and cumbersome for doing that job really, so I just had to keep heating it up and manipulating it with a screwdriver until it eventually prized off, but it's come off okay there, and the pins do look okay Need to make sure I remember which way around that went. Hopefully they should pop straight through there, which they do. And then we've just got to solder them back up, which again might be a little bit of a job because my soldering iron isn't the finest or the best, but we'll manage. Alright, so either this display was a dud or it's not compatible as is. I tend to think, based on the fact that I was supplying the correct DC voltage to the backlight and the backlight wasn't lighting up, then it might be a dud. But who knows, I'm not really qualified to check any deeper. So after a little bit of research, I've noted a few things. Number one, looking at the back of the original screen, if I peel off this sticker, you can see that this is a chip HD44780 and this is an HD44100. Now it turns out one of those chips is a controller and one of them is a driver. What those chips do exactly is not too important, but I think it's effectively, well, one actually drives the pixels, if you like, on the LCD display, turns them on and off, and the other one actually translates into characters and all that kind of thing. But the point is, both of these chips are required to run the display. When I look at the display that I bought, I'd assumed that under these two little black blobs on the back here, it contains both a driver and a controller, just like this one, but I've got a feeling it doesn't. The problem is, normally when you buy these kind of things, you would get a data sheet with them that would tell you exactly what they do, what the pinouts are, what voltages they run on, and all that kind of stuff. But because this was an AliExpress cheapie, it didn't come with any such thing. Maybe with a little bit more digging around I might be able to find one, but I certainly couldn't see one anyway. So I've ordered another one in the post and it's arrived. Now this is much the same kind of thing. It's a different model, although this time it's the model with 16 pins on the top because I don't actually intend to use the full display. The thing that's a little bit annoying is there's a guy on eBay selling replacement screens all fully wired up, ready to plug and play for about 50 quid. And for me, well, I wouldn't call that an extortionate price, because although I know damn well the hardware he's using probably comes to no more than about £5, I do understand that obviously if he's actually fabricating the things himself, then, you know, an hour's skilled labour, well, you could call that maybe 30, 40 quid, something like that. So it's not really extortionate, but when you know that the parts only cost a couple of quid, it's more than you really want to pay. I'm half tempted to buy one just to look at what he's actually using and see if I can source the parts myself for future reference. If I ever do that, I will let you know. So I think the plan at the moment is probably going to be to actually just transfer the backlight from this screen to the old screen if I can. One thing that's kind of cool was I've got this old, I think I've shown you already, I've got this old board that arrived again from AliExpress, but it arrived broken. The glass was broken on the screen, but the backlight itself does actually work. Now this runs off a 9-volt battery, but again I think the backlight on the display is actually 5 volts. And I just wanted to show you the difference in brightness between the old display and this display, just for comparison. And you can see that it's lighting up. It's LEDs, they are working, they're just not particularly bright. But let me just show you this for comparison. Look how much brighter that is. So yeah, the big question is going to be whether or not this display has a backlight that I can steal or not. Now last time I accidentally fried the display. I've obviously got my wiring colours wrong because these are quite clearly labelled anode and cathode, and from my valve amp experience at least, I would expect the anodes to be positively charged and I would expect the red wire to carry the positive charge, but apparently not. Okay, so we know that backlight works. We need to remove the old display. Say the old display, the broken new display, and try and get that backlight into the original display. Not exactly the most professional job in the world, but I think that will work. Okay, I've just realised that taking that off might not have been the best idea, only because the contacts for controlling the screen are actually in the bottom of this strip. I can't see them, they must be there, that's the only thing that is making contact. So a slight problem. If I light the backlight up there, it's off centre at the moment. You see that tab at the end? So I'm going to have to move it. And actually it's a bit close to these pins on the end anyway. Just keep making more work for myself. There we go, much better. I think it's still actually ever so slightly off. But close enough that it covers all the characters. Okay, so some more lessons learned. When I tried to fit this board, or rather this new display, by soldering the pins, the existing pins, through the side of the display, it worked rather well, but unfortunately the display itself didn't seem to work for whatever reason. However, when I came to remove the pins from that display, it turned out that I basically broke the connector trying to remove it from the display, mainly because just the equipment I had for removing the solder wasn't particularly good. Not to worry. So the ribbon cable connector that goes to the main board, which is this thing here, is actually just a standard connector. I believe it's a 14-pin IDC connector it's called, and you can buy these from all the usual places for absolutely next to nothing. I can only assume that this was designed so that it should have been easy enough to just actually pull this off the display, just the same as it is to pull it off the system board, but due to time and everything like that, it just didn't want to budge, which is why I ended up soldering it off. I should have probably actually just persevered in pulling it off, but I wasn't too sure at the time whether or not it was actually designed to be pulled off. Not to worry. So as I say, there's a new cable on the way, and it just so happened with the display I got plenty of these little pins anyway that can be soldered in, and those are the pins that these connectors are designed to push onto. So that's easy enough to mock up again, but what I'm left with is a whole host of half working or not working displays. It turned out actually that the cable I ordered to replace this one, rather frustratingly, is coming from China. I'm getting rather sick of people on the likes of Amazon and eBay listing items as located in the UK, then drop shipping them from China. I'm fully aware that I can buy them direct from China myself, but I pay the price that people in the UK are charging for them to actually have them shipped from the UK. I've got nothing against people drop shipping from the UK if that's what they want to do, but they should be very honest about delivery times, in my opinion. I did try cutting the damaged end off the cable with mine to actually just soldering it directly onto the pins, but I just don't really have the equipment or the skill to be able to do that neatly. So I definitely think a new cable is going to be the way to go. And then if I just use those pins, I can slide the new cable onto the pins, no problem. In the meantime, I got some of these. As you've already seen, I have a little standard prototyping board which is designed to make little mock-up circuits, and normally you would get these wires sort of pre-tinned and whatnot, and you can just push them into these holes and create circuits around the board. But in addition to those, you can get these ones which are exactly the same idea, but they're actually female ones, so they can either have these wires pushed into them to make a connection, which, I mean, to be fair, isn't really that advisable, but it does work. There we go. Or it will connect onto the standoff pins that would be connecting up to things. So what I've done in the meantime, while I'm waiting for that cable to arrive, just try and zoom in here, is take the original display, which we know currently has a busted backlight, and I've just used it to connect those pins directly to the motherboard socket here. And just for anyone who wanted to try and do that, or anyone who's wondering, the pin out on the screen is exactly the same as the board if you were to hold the screen directly above the board in this orientation. But if I leave that connected up as it is at the moment, as I said, we know the backlight's not working, but if I turn the power on, and what I've done is I've actually just slid a piece of white paper in there behind the display so that we've got a piece of even contrast material. And then if I turn my torch on my phone and shine it in the side there, hopefully you should just be able to see that display is working. So I can read all the characters on the screen there quite clearly. Obviously if it was properly backlit it would be a lot more legible, but that just shows me that the display itself is still working and the pinout is correct. Little word of advice actually, if ever you're considering removing this display, it's only held on with these little tabs of metal on the back which you can bend, and if you bend all 6 of them straight so that they can fit through the holes on the board, this front display minus the backlight will pop straight off. But what I didn't realise is that the display actually makes direct contact with the circuit board without any real kind of connector or anything like that. So if I take this one where the display and the backlight's been removed, you can see that it's just got all these little metal contacts on there, and depending on the quality of display you've got, it can be quite difficult to get those to line up. On this original display I think it took me about 2 attempts just to make sure that they were all lined up and making good connections, so it wasn't the end of the world, but that is just something to bear in mind. So on the note of the exploding backlights, I had a little look online and I happened to come across a schematic for one of these modern reproductions of the same display type, and it did actually say as a footnote on the data sheet for one of these that the LED backlight, although it is indeed 5 volts, which this unit is putting out 5 volts, you can get 3 volt ones, but this one is 5 volts. In fact, actually I think at the minute this these connectors are actually putting out slightly less than 5 volts. Anyway, it did say on the data sheet, however, though, that you're not supposed to connect the backlight directly to the power supply. Even though the voltage is correct, there's not sufficient resistance in the LEDs to stop an unreasonable amount of current flowing, which is why I think the first time I tried it, basically the backlight went instantly pop. Then I tried it on another display, which was obviously a little bit better made, and it worked very brightly, but after maybe 10 minutes or so, that one burnt out as well. The data sheet that I saw actually suggested a nominal value of about 10 ohms for the backlight to insert a resistor basically in between the power supply and the backlight of about 10 ohms. Funnily enough, that is, even though I'm not particularly knowledgeable on these things, that is something I did actually do in the first instance by default, and I just didn't actually happen to notice any difference between having the resistor there and having the resistor not there, so I opted not to have it there. So what I'm actually going to do is try and work with this original display, put a new backlight in yet again, but this time stick a resistor in there, and then hopefully it won't burn out. If we can get that working and we can show that it's reliably working, when the new cable arrives, it should just be a case of push the new cable on and away we go. Hey everyone, so as you can probably tell, this repair is going on a lot longer than I expected it to, and as such the video time's crept up, and I don't really want to make anyone sit here longer than about half an hour. So because of that, I've decided to split this video into 2 parts. The second part is pretty much ready to go, so it will be following shortly after this one. If you've spotted anything that I've done wrong so far, or you think you might have the solution for my problems or answer to my questions relating to this unit or just life in general, do let me know in the comments below. But until next time, goodbye.